Too late.
I've been working all day. I'm so tired.
Go ahead.
Ready? Good evening, buenas noches. Welcome to the CPJ offices here in New York. I'm Natalie Southwick, the Central and South America researcher here at CPJ, and we're here for the Ni Uno Mas panel discussion with CPJ and NAHJ on journalist security and safety in Venezuela. Buenas noches a todos. Mi nombre es Natalie Southwick. Yo soy la investigadora de Centro y Sudamérica del CPJ. Estamos aquí en la oficina de CPJ para una discusión sobre la seguridad de periodistas en Venezuela. Entonces, yo voy a presentar a los dos panelistas. I'm going to present our two panelists tonight. The first is Adriana Loredo Fernandez, who's actually joining us from Caracas, Venezuela. So that's why she can't be here in the room, but we'll be hearing her voice in the background. Adriana, if you'd like to say hi.
Hi, everyone.
And Carlos Beltran, who is also a Venezuelan journalist based here in New York City.
Mm-hmm. Hello, Carlos Beltran. I'm a producer for NBC.
So there are a couple different topics that we want to talk about tonight. You know, the issue of journalist security and safety is obviously something that's an international concern, but I think we've seen a lot over the last year in Venezuela that has made this a particular focal point for folks across the region. With obviously the deterioration of the political situation, we saw several months of protests over the summer, which have sort of died down given more recent elections, but we've seen a wide range of different types of violence and threats to journalists that go from physical aggression to police violence, to equipment being stolen, to censorship. And so we wanted to give an opportunity to journalists who have worked on the ground there to talk a little more about what's actually happening, because often that information isn't really getting to audiences in the US or English-speaking audiences or people outside of Venezuela. And so we wanted to take this opportunity to hear a little bit more about that directly. So Adriana, if you'd like to start off by talking about your experience working on the ground there, anything that has happened to you or friends, anything that you've been through while covering, particularly the protests over the summer, but anything related to the political situation in Venezuela.
Sure. So I'm a journalist, Venezuelan born, and
we've got a little problem with the connection there. Carlos, if you want to jump in for a second, we'll see if we can get that audio back.
Absolutely. Hopefully she's still there.
Yes.
Online. Well, just like Adriana, I'm Venezuelan born. I have a bit of a history with the government of Venezuela being a journalist over there. If I wanted to talk about something that's actually of interest to other journalists, Venezuelan or not, is about the risks of going over there. And I know the CPJ provides training, risk training, that's very important, but what I tell all of my colleagues before going to Venezuela, and actually I was talking to one of them today at NBC, is always be aware of the political situation over there. And sometimes it's not as over what you would want to call it exaggerated as it could be. So I actually have a couple of anecdotes that I could share with you guys, but I don't know if that's the time I'm happy to share them when it comes to understanding what happens there.
I feel like almost everyone who's worked on the ground there has their own set of anecdotes,
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely. So that's basically it. I know we want to talk about first the stories that are coming out of Venezuela. And again, I've over the past 7-8 years, I've been able to work with several U.S.-based networks. And that's important because nowadays, not to diverge so much, we're talking right now, but you have to understand that journalist visas are not granted right now, or at least they're not as easily obtained as you would. So that leaves a lot of networks either not risking, sending someone without a journalist visa, or in my case, or like it happened in my case, I worked with being Venezuelan and being on the ground, worked for several networks at the same time. yeah, there's a lot of colleagues in Venezuela who are currently producing stories for that. But either way, yes, you're right. There's a lot of stories to be shared, with everything from stolen equipment to being within the SEBIN, which is the intelligence department in Venezuela, for basically doing my job, or whatever journalist or whoever journalists out there doing their jobs in Venezuela could be at risk of being put inside the SEBIN, or questioned or interrogated because of doing their job. So,
what do you think are the biggest risks or challenges for journalists who are working in Venezuela?
It's definitely more than twofold, but you're not only at risk because the situation in Venezuela is so dire when it comes to the, sociopolitics and economics. I mean, like, literally being out there with a camera could mean that someone could come and basically at gunpoint try to steal your equipment. But if you're spotted by, say, national security, National Guard, any policemen out there in the wrong area, then you could be questioned as if, what are you doing? I've produced several stories over the past, 4 years. Everything that has to do with food scarcity, medicine scarcity, the violence in Venezuela, and yes, I mean, you could very, very well, and it happened to me and a correspondent to 2016. While I was working on a story over there, we could be, brought in. No, you cannot do anything about it. They just bring you in and put you inside of a police car, take you to the SEBIN, and then question you. And if you're with an American network, which is what happened to me, they could possibly make it into a like a political stand, like an international stand.
I mean, I think we saw that a few times over the summer. There was a case of 2 journalists who worked for a French outlet who were detained for a number of days. There have been a few cases of journalists working for international outlets or that are based abroad that had been stopped when they were trying to leave the country. And so I think that's, perhaps more of a concern for people that are coming from outside Venezuela to cover the country. Adriana, do we have you back on the line?
I just want to make sure you can hear me.
Yes. Yes, so please feel free to, answer that. We'd love to hear a little bit about your work on the ground there as well.
Yeah, I would also add that, since we're not in the middle of a conventional war, sometimes journalists come here with a certain idea of what they're going to encounter, and I would say you should come with the mentality, that you would have when you go to a war zone, even though it doesn't out that way. But just having that extra security in mind for yourself can go like such a long way. There's a way you can be extra careful here. And as you were talking, I mean, having equipment in Venezuela is a danger on its own, not necessarily because of censorship, but because violence is just. So actually anything that is considered of value, especially technology, comes with certain risks that you need to keep in mind.
Right.
And then also, of course, SEBIN, the political police. I don't really know how to handle that, because I see it like a room. You don't really know what type of war or investigation is going to call their attention. You don't know how they filter that. So caution on, what you investigate and the way you frame stories.
I think that's an interesting point, is having to kind of engage almost in self-censorship while you're working on stories, is understanding, what you can print, what you may not want to print, or what kind of photos you want to show, and having to think about not only telling the story itself, but telling the story in a way that's going to keep you and your colleagues safe. And speaking of equipment, that was something that we noticed here at CPJ over the course of the summer, kind of tracking all these incidents. We were issuing weekly safety updates for journalists on the ground. as a way of kind of providing practical information that we felt could help journalists who were working there, since they were often facing threats from the state itself, in addition to other actors. And we noticed a really clear trend of different state security forces, as well as protesters and other sort of non-state groups, targeting journalists and taking specifically their phones and also cameras. And I think, cameras are often, they're a high value object. People are going to notice that, but this very clear, concerted effort to interfere with people's ability to cover the protests and to record it on phones was something that we noticed as a pretty clear trend coming from the state. And I'm also curious for both of you, maybe Adriana, if you want to start. One thing that we'd also noticed was perhaps because the protests were more concentrated in Caracas, or because there are more journalists based in Caracas, there's more resources. That's where a lot of international reporters are coming. It was a little bit easier to hear what was happening there. And Venezuela is a big country. It's not all Caracas.
Relatively
and
big country, yeah.
Fairly big. And there's a lot happening in the regions outside of the capital that is perhaps not even getting attention there, much less in international media. So I don't know if you want to speak to anything that you saw outside of the city, or any different challenges for journalists that are working outside of major media.
Sure. I would say pre-production and, for stories here is so important, and it's getting more and more difficult every time, because you need to think about every single detail. Everything can become like a serious complication at some point. So it's very hard to find cash. When you go outside of the capital, you really do need cash for a lot of transactions. So then you need to take, like, I don't know, maybe a couple of weeks going every day to the bank to withdraw cash and be able to take that with you on the road. Then you also need to think about tickets. It's almost impossible to fly locally, and buses are, you need to get in line the day before, sleep in front of the bus station, maybe if you're lucky to get a bus ticket. Same happens with food. You need to take at least basic supplies with you, because you may find that there's no food, or finding food takes a day or two. Same with potable water. It's important.
So basically, all of these resources that you would normally have access to fairly easily when covering a story suddenly become a much bigger challenge to being able to do your work.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, yeah. Obviously. Oh, sorry, I think she's still talking. Sorry, Adriana. I was just going to add that she's talking about pre-production, which is very important when it comes to moving from state to state over there. But I would also talk about your contacts. Mm-hmm. So that is incredibly important. And I don't know if at this point I'm talking to the general audience or other journalists who are thinking or might be thinking about going over there. But when it comes to security protocols, though, one thing is prepare for obvious essentials, but another security protocols, and that is being always aware of whose security or what your security is like over there. Transportation, yes. Obviously, we moved. For example, I ran a story in 2016 when I had to travel to Valencia. Valencia is a city that's supposedly 2.5 hours from Caracas. That's what people say in terms of distance. Mm-hmm. But it could take you, it took us, because of an accident on the road, 6 hours to go from Caracas to Valencia. Then we got there at nighttime, and that's when we tried to run the story at nighttime at a hospital that got me and a correspondent and I, arrested in 2016, simply because of going into a hospital and at the outskirts of Caracas, because obviously that's another thing. The further away you get from Caracas, the less resources they have, less food, less medicine. In Caracas, it's also hard to get those things, but if you have money, you could probably find someone who will get it for you. Mm-hmm. in Valencia, in that case, which only, again, just a relatively short distance from Caracas, the hospitals were going through hardships, even more dire ones than in Caracas in 2016. And for doing our jobs there in the middle of the night, then we got in serious trouble in 2016. I was doing a story, and I know I can say this because the journalist that went with me already published this, but I was doing a story with ABC News, and simply because we were shooting inside of a hospital in Valencia. And I'm not talking flashy cameras. I'm talking that we filmed everything with a handy cam and then a GoPro. And we hadn't been there more than 15 minutes when someone that was not supposed to see us, said, "Oh, there's an American there, or gringo," how they say over there. I mean, I passed obviously as a Venezuelan. Our producer was Mexican, so she passed as a Venezuelan, but our correspondent was, very flashy white correspondent type. And so he got spotted, and then we spent the next 5 days inside of a Sebin in Valencia, which is, again, about 2.5 hours. So, yeah, that's obviously something that is not, that I wouldn't recommend anyone to go through.
Spending time with the
Absolutely. Because as Adriana was saying, there are no guarantees over there. So, like, even what happened to us, I mean, we were asking for a phone call. And especially the American correspondent he had been in Venezuela a few times, but he was asking for a phone call because he thought that was his right.
Right.
There's no guarantees. You won't get a phone call, or no. It was up until the third day when we were allowed to see a lawyer that would tell us what it is that was happening. Either way, no guarantees. Things don't work by the book over there whatsoever. So journalism has become a bit of a clandestine profession over there in Venezuela, and the fact that there are no national broadcast channels that are openly talking about what's happening over there is proof of it.
So we had a question come in from Facebook that we'd like to take, and it's: what essentials do journalists covering violent protests in Venezuela carry to keep safe or use for first aid? This is a great question. Actually, we'll talk a little bit more about that training, but what have you seen? What kind of things do journalists who cover the protests have to carry with them? We, as part of our safety advisories, will encourage people to have as much equipment as they can safely carry, and that's if you have a gas mask, obviously, and you're expecting that more often than not, security forces will be firing tear gas, so it's good to have something that will allow you to breathe, basic first aid kit. Certainly something. We can talk about identification separately, but Adriana, what kind of things do journalists who are covering protests carry to stay safe?
The basics. I would say a helmet is really important. A gas mask, definitely. The vest is helpful, especially this protest. It wasn't as necessary, I would say, in 2014, but 2017 proved to be necessity. And then I would also suggest good as you can, equipment-wise, also.
Anything else?
Well, I haven't, and I need to take the CPJ security courses that you guys absolutely provide. Mine has been a history of called street smarts. What I do is, ironically, if you wear a vest that says press, either in the back or the front, that will just bring more attention to yourself.
So that was something we heard over the summer, which was really interesting because, sort of the conventional wisdom says you should always identify yourself. You want to say prensa on your vest and on your helmet and everything. Right. And in most contexts, I think that's true. That's what you'll do to stay safe. And people that we talked to in Venezuela were not fully, some people said, yes, I do this just to have it as kind of a cover, but other people said that they chose not to because they felt it put a target on their back.
Right. There's a stigma about having a camera out there, even a bigger one if you're international press.
Right.
Here's the thing: if you're a local journalist, there's just a handful, as far as I know, a handful of digital-based broadcast news networks out there that are just operating out of YouTube. So that's how people get their news, through Twitter and YouTube.
Absolutely.
You don't get a national broadcast network over there. If you're an international journalist, then that's how a lot of news get out there. So there's like a very precarious stigma about being an international journalist over there. So no, actually, when I moved around, I was there this summer, and I was covering some news for NBC, and I had my vest for security purposes only, not for identification, like underneath my whatever shirt I was wearing over there. So that was something interesting to have. I also always move around everywhere with someone on a motorbike. They have to be on a bike because if you want to move quickly from point A to point B, you just get in the backseat of the bike and you just fly off. So I never go anywhere, or at least when I've covered conflict in Venezuela, I never go anywhere without someone on a bike.
And I think that gets at, this is a little less tangible, I suppose, than having your helmet and your vest. But a lot of people said that they made sure to stick together. And it's an interesting question, I think, especially for photojournalists, because you often want to kind of be on your own because you're trying to get the shot and you don't want everyone having the same picture. But people felt that it was worth it to kind of give up that, wanting to beat the competition, as it were, in order to actually stick together for safety. I don't know if that's something that either of you have encountered.
In my experience, sometimes it depends on the situation. I think it varies from situation to situation. Sometimes I'll do that just because if they take you, and they may, you want someone to know that you've been taken, because that kind of gives you a little bit of safety. Because they'll know whatever law enforcement agency took you, so it's just ugly. I would say, but then also when you're in a bunch and covering, that makes you a big target. I mean, it has happened to me that we're in a group and we're directly shot at from security forces and law enforcement agencies. So it kind of varies, I would say.
That seems like a big trade-off for a lot of people on the ground in Venezuela, is this question of what helps you stay safe and what makes you more of a target, and how do you kind of weigh those two different concerns and balance those when the same identifying yourself as press may do both or neither, depending on what context you're in. And one thing that both of you have touched on is the idea of having specific training. I think CPJ is fortunate to get to we are involved with risk training, which is reporters instructed in saving colleagues. And that's an organization that was started by Sebastian Younger a couple years ago that offers medical training specifically for journalists. And we actually Risk did their first training in South America, in Medellin, Colombia, about a week ago. And I know a couple of Venezuelan journalists got the chance to attend that. And that's something that we've heard from certainly people from many countries, but especially Venezuelan journalists have said, we really want this hands-on training that will help us learn how to respond if our colleague is hit by a tear gas canister or, someone is shot in a protest. I know two of the people that attended, one of them have been hit repeatedly with canisters while covering protests. One person was attacked by a group of civilians. And that the sense is that there are not a lot of opportunities within the country at the moment for journalists to get that kind of training. And Adriana, I know you've done risk training, so I'd love to hear your thoughts on how that might be valuable to your colleagues in Venezuela.
I would suggest that everyone working in the profession, especially covering protests, take any security training. I mean, I loved risk training. It was an intensive 4-day training session, and I learned so many things that are actually pretty useful now. I got shot a couple of times too and I guess it wasn't life-threatening, of course, but it did help just to heal myself quick and get back to work. So, and that just happened so much. I remember this year, most of my colleagues, people I talk to on a daily basis, injured. There's so many of them. And, we relied heavily this year, at least, on the Green Cross and other kind of work on the ground. But sometimes I think to myself, okay, well, if they weren't here, like, how we solve this, and none of us really had that much of a clue. So I would just say that's so necessary in a situation like in these type of situations.
Right. Do you want to explain what the Green Cross is quickly?
Yeah,
who needs to know that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I did a story for NBC News on the Green Crosses in Venezuela, and basically they're a university founded. There's a group of medical students and also some veterans that volunteer their specialties to aid not only protesters, but anyone who might be injured during the protests. So they've actually helped members of the National Guard or policemen, but more often they do help protesters who are in the middle. They get caught in the middle of front lines of the conflict. So yeah, absolutely.
And what do you think is the value of journalists being trained in how to respond? I mean, we've heard from Adriana how it helps her when she experienced that firsthand, but just going into a situation where you're covering a dangerous protest and having that knowledge.
Well, I mean, obviously, it's incredibly valuable. It's common sense that if you know how to react when you're in the middle of, even if it's an unpredictable scenario, if you're aware of the risks and if you know how to handle them, especially if you handle some minor medical issues, then obviously you'll be aware. When you know that certain things can happen when you're put in the middle of a fire, let's call it, then obviously that's good.
Right.
There's no cons when it comes to being trained
for
conflicts.
Yes.
So yeah.
And I think it's interesting, that both of you have used these terms of war and conflict when talking about the situation in Venezuela, because it's, I think in the way it's often presented is not quite that dire. It's, there's a political crisis, but I think, and we've certainly heard from other journalists working on the ground there as well, that this, in terms of working there and covering the protests, it often can feel like a conflict region.
There's a humanitarian crisis over there, but you have to also understand that Venezuela comes from years of extreme violence.
Right.
So it's war not only because of political conflict, but because you can be killed for a pair of shoes or a cell phone over there, wherever you are. So it's like that's the amount of people that die per month in Venezuela as a whole, not only in Caracas, the capital. It's so outstanding that there is sometimes no other way to call it but like a state of war over there.
And that's, I think, important for media organizations to keep in mind as well when they're sending people there to cover it, is that it is, in many senses, a dangerous assignment. It's not, your standard political reporting even.
Sure.
So we're going to start wrapping up because there's, all of us, I think, could talk about Venezuela for hours.
Sure.
But I would love to hear from both of you either, anything that you think that the international community should keep in mind for journalists in Venezuela, that people in the U.S. who want to support their colleagues there can do, or even any of the stories that you think should be getting told from Venezuela that we're not seeing. Adriana, if you want to comment on either of those.
Well, regarding stories, I would say it's very hard just because, we do depend on, the news cycle, the United States in many ways. Like there's so many things happening right now that we can't cover them even locally. So I can kind of understand that outstanding cases kind of get approved and are heard over there. But I do think the most stories are getting attention, which is certainly the humanitarian crisis and violations of human rights, and that it happens every day.
Carlos?
Sure. I think for every conflict, whether it's economic, social, or political over there, there's a face. And I feel like several, if not all, but several networks that have managed to get either local journalists in Venezuela to produce stories for them because they cannot send their correspondents over there, or they manage to come into the country, they find a face, they find a character-driven story, which is very important when you want to, actually portray what's happening over there. Like Adriana was saying, it's a lot of things happening in like tiny sections and segments of the country, but there is a bigger picture, a bigger problem in the economics and the social aspects and the political one in Venezuela. And I feel confident when I say that in today's environment, where you have a lot of freelancers producing content overseas, and there are a lot of freelancers producing content for U.S.-based networks in Venezuela, that these stories have at least the possibility of coming out, which probably wouldn't have been the case if we had this political climate 10 years ago. Now there's a lot of boots on the ground. I'm happy to say that I have a lot of colleagues that I hope that they're being safe or they're staying safe in Venezuela. So,
and we're here to try to give them the information
Absolutely.
to stay safe. And they can hopefully consult, the information on CPJ's page and look into risk training, certainly, and talk to people that have been there. Thank you both for... Yes, please, go ahead.
And I would also add, always challenge the official version of things in Venezuela, like always. That's just the general kind of advice for anyone who's working in the country. Always challenge the official version.
Yeah, I think follow up and know your sources is always good to know. Thank you so much for joining both of us, and Adriana for calling in from Caracas, where it's a little bit later and we're dealing with power outages and whatnot, but we really appreciate hearing from you. So thank you both for joining us tonight, and to everyone watching, please feel free to follow them on social media, follow us, and stay in touch with CPJ and NAHJ for this campaign going forward.
Absolutely.
Buenas noches.